this is Outdoor Action's 50th anniversary year, and so for anybody who's not familiar with Outdoor Actions is the university's outdoor education program, and the very first trip was in the fall of the first sort of official freshman trip. That's what it was called at that point. Now Frost trip was the fall of '74. There was a pilot program in the fall of '73 and one in the spring of '74. Ed was one of the very first leaders.
Oh yeah, shout me out, sure.
Right. Okay. There was a guy in the class of 1970 named Steve Belke who worked as an assistant dean in the dean of students office, and he wrote this proposal in '73 saying, "Why don't we do an outdoor-based program for incoming first-year students?" And in those days, in the '70s, this was before the residential college system, right? So there was nothing for first-year students, right? You had an RA, now called an RCA, and that was it. And first-year students lived in the crummiest dorms on campus. Whatever was left over from room draw that nobody wanted, that's where first-years lived, right? And so there wasn't a lot of support systems. So somebody said, hey, why don't we do something like an Outward Bound type program for incoming students as a way to build community and use the challenge of the outdoors as this vehicle for bringing people together. And that was the start of OA. And so we are now 50 years in. And so this year we always do a panel at reunions and reception. But in September, we invite everybody to join us. We are doing a weekend celebration on campus in September. Friday, the September 20th, Saturday the 21st, and Sunday the 22nd. So that's really going to be our big sort of celebration. And our goal is just to bring generations of OA leaders back. There are 3,700 OA leaders. 26,000 people have gone on Frost Trip over the last 50 years. So our goal is to sort of bring the OA leader community together with current student leaders and celebrate. So we invite you all to come join us for that in the fall. And so our big plug is, that's just a little quick pre-register thing, and it's up here. Snap that with your phone. Just tell us, hey, I'm excited to come. That will help us plan over the summer, and we'll send the registration stuff out. This is sort of too small to read, but this is like the general sort of idea of what our program's going to be. So Friday will be just a kind of a welcome reception. We'll be in the new Frick Chemistry Building for people who know the big atrium down there. And then Saturday in the morning will kind of be like reunions. Like what we're envisioning is panels of people talking about different sort of topics. So everything from conservation to healthcare to education. OA leaders are doing incredible things all over the place. And so the idea is sort of bringing people together in like interest groups. One of the most fun things that I've experienced in all my time at OA is when different generations come together around a shared interest. And that always happens at our receptions and things like that, where suddenly you're talking to somebody who's, many years different from you in classes, but you're both doing solar energy or you're both doing conservation work. And you walk away with this like incredible network of, wow, that was so cool to talk to that person. So that will be Saturday morning. Will just be, a chance for us to sort of share what people are doing and really thinking about how leadership at OA has had an impact on what those experiences that you all are having. Then after lunch, we're going to go outside. So the afternoon is going to be outdoor adventures all afternoon. And then we'll have a keynote dinner on Saturday night. And then Sunday will be more sort of discussions, but really talking about what should the next 50 years look like. So we've had our first 50, and I've been here for 43, and 4 years as an undergrad. So I've been around for 47 of the 50. So I've been lucky enough to see this thing grow, and it's going to be really exciting to think about how we launch the next 50. So, so that's a lot about what the upcoming event will be. And so we're here. After this, there is a reception upstairs. And the other thing that we're inviting, everyone to do is, Vlad, who's doing our video for today, is going to be upstairs. We would love to get like 1 minute, quickie videos with you, just sort of saying, hey, why was outdoor action important? We're putting together a 50th anniversary video. And so Vlad will be upstairs in room 102. And so for any of you who are willing to just sort of share a couple snippets, that will be wonderful as something for us to be able to share in the fall. And then on Sunday, we always do our outdoor action, just sort of alumni breakfast over at Chancellor Green Rotunda. And so that's another great, as you're heading out the door from reunions, to stop and catch up with OA people. So here are our illustrious people on the panel. And so I'll ask you all to introduce yourself. Wait, I'll start with you.
Hi, is this good?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Leila. I am class of 2024, graduating from the CEE department. I've been a leader trainer for 3 years and went on a frost trip with OA. So I just led my 10th trip this fall. No, this spring, right now.
What about yesterday?
Yesterday, I finished my 10th trip.
I'm gonna take this off because I don't want to leave. Maybe not. All right, cool. Hello, everybody. Caroline Stone Perkins, class of 2014. Know many faces in the room, which is exciting, either from overlapping with you during our time at OA or having attended many of these panels, but happy to be speaking here. I graduated in 2014, and the Monday after graduation, I started working full-time for OA. It was a little bit of a rough turnaround. Rick, if you ever have anyone doing that again, please give them at least a week of vacation. It was a little rough, but it was great. I was involved with OA as a student, frost trip coordinator for 2 summers, leader trainer. A lot of time spent in Dillon Court West, the trailer that used to be our office. And then I worked for OA for about 8.5 years. I work at Bristol Myers Squibb, a pharmaceutical company just down the road from here. And I work in the strategy department, working on the people side. So whenever the company has a new strategic initiative happening, whether that's we're acquiring a new company, we're building a new lab, we're using a new software, there's other people who figure out all the great solutions of like whatever that is. I don't know anything about the pharmaceutical industry other than EpiPens are a lot more expensive than they should be. I talk about that a lot. We don't make EpiPens, but I talk about that a lot. I work a lot to connect with people who do make auto injectors. But that's about all I know. But I do, for my time working with OA, I understand people and understand interpersonal dynamics and understand the importance of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and thinking from that perspective. So when they're making a change, I'm like, all right, that's great. How are we going to talk about that? Who are we going to train? How are we going to bring people on board so that they really understand the change and are committed to the change so that the change can then be successful?
I was a leader trainer as well. I came to Princeton from Canada. And OA for me was like my grounding group here, if you will. And I now live in Park City. I moved there about 4 years ago, and it was in part because I missed the outdoors after having been in London, New York, and San Francisco. We'll get on to the topic of OA and leadership in a second, but in terms of my background, I worked for a couple of years with the Mandela government right after college, bringing electricity to the townships, then decided to go to medical school and business school at Stanford. I didn't practice medicine. I went and worked in the UK with the Blair administration trying to fix the NHS. Deep down, though, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. So, and that'll be a topic that I'll discuss in a bit. So I started a healthcare big data and analytics company about 9 years ago in the Bay Area. And we had a hell of a ride. It may end up being that we spectacularly spent way too much money trying to do something, waiting for the government to change things that didn't happen. But, OA was an amazing training ground that, allowed me to go on that entrepreneurial journey. And it's amazing to be able to be here and reflect on that in a little bit of a different way. And I just had an amazing run this morning down the towpath, saw a couple of people in kayaks, and I was like, wow, reminded me of my best moments at Princeton.
Fantastic. So really sort of the first question I want to start with is, like, always been training leaders for 50 years now. It's pretty amazing. And Leila, sort of starting with you, like, how do you utilize leadership and the things that you have learned from OA?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what I've learned from leading with OA is that leadership is kind of all about adaptability. I think it's adaptability. I think like it's thinking with a clear head about what a situation is and like further what that means, trying to kind of get to the bottom of kind of purpose and goals and where you are, where you want to be, which are greater skills than just leading a group of people. It's kind of how to lead yourself in this world. And so, I mean, a lot of kind of the work that I've done in the past 5 years since I started at Princeton was outdoors work. And so obviously very directly applicable there, but more so just in everyday life. Trying to understand myself and the way that I approach a problem, trying to understand my friends and my peers and how we can kind of form a more cohesive unit and how we can achieve things together more than we could just achieve on our own. Yeah. Should I be more specific?
That's great.
A big leadership experience that I drew almost entirely from OA on was I was the president of Terrace last year. And so I was all of a sudden faced with 5 officers who, really wanted to do really great things for our club, and I did too. But we were all just like completely separate. We were different people in every aspect of it. And so kind of using OA and using like an FEC to bring these people together and try to understand what our common goals are, and being able to sort of talk one-on-one using like the strategies of interpersonal skills and interpersonal dynamics to understand both how to help them get what they want out of this experience, but also how to like progress towards goals and towards kind of like peace in the nation, if you will, just like as a group. And I think it was generally very, very successful.
We don't have to talk in a line.
Yeah, you can
but
go
I'm
wherever.
happy to go, but I can go. Okay, but then the next one we have to break it up. Gotta be flexible in there. So as I said in my intro, oh hey Abby, I didn't see you sneak in. OA leader with me, and then later roommate. As I was saying in my intro, a lot of what I do now is like the people side of strategy, and I think that in parallel to that, one of my big takeaways from OA leader training and then my many years leading OA leader training alongside Rick, so I really had to learn every little bit of our curriculum, is the people side and making sure that we spend a lot of time thinking not just about like what we're going to accomplish, but how are we going to take people along on this journey. And so I don't think there's a lot of other spaces, both at Princeton, but also like out in the real world where you're taught how to do that. I think all OA leaders get a really intensive training on how to navigate interpersonal situations and decision making and conflict resolution. And then I had that like supercharged, living and breathing OA for so many years. And then to the point that some things became second nature. I didn't really think about every time that I'm like asking an open-ended question or reflectively listening. That's just like what I have to do. And now I'm in a totally different environment with a bunch of lab scientists who are really, really good at chemistry and molecular biology. And that's how they've spent all of their time. And my husband's a lab scientist, so I'm not saying anything disrespectful to them. But there's not a lot of exposure necessarily. It hasn't been that same training for how to, think about the human side of navigating a change. And so I'll walk into a space or I'll be leading a workshop, and the reactions I get from people is just like awe. Like, how did you do that? And I'm like, I used to do this like weekly when I was in OA. This is just like a normal workshop. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't anything special. But it's such a different skill set than what a lot of my coworkers have, that it's made me really appreciate so much that I learned from OA. And I think that OA, at least from the start of when I've been here, and I imagine from the very start, has been really good at helping students identify how to transfer skills and lessons learned in the outdoors into other spaces. Because so few, Rick, you would know the stats, but so few, such a small percentage of OA leaders go on into outdoor education. Allie, you were my one example for many years. And Anthony and Anna Nillis, those are my people. So we, you got to figure out how do we take what we learn here and apply it in many different contexts. And so it's been exciting to now be on the other side of that journey, having helped people figure out how to apply it, and now being like, oh, I got a lot I can do with, my outdoor skills.
Yeah. So overall, here's what I'd say is, certainly in this case, like massive type A personality, super goal oriented. I think that would describe a lot of Princeton students coming in. And if I reflect on like which individual faculty, whomever had the biggest impact on, my life coming out of Princeton and what I've been able to do since, Rick, it's you. And, why is that through this lens of leadership? Well, I would say one, everything you put in place around the leader training, I think taught me that the journey, and in fact, the learning journey, is just as important as the ultimate goal. Okay. And then as I think of it through the lens of really being able to finally have the courage to do what I wanted to do, which is to be an entrepreneur, but it took me 20 years to have the guts to get there. So there's three words as I was thinking about this that came to mind for me. One is entrepreneurship. The other one is resilience. And the last one is empathy. And I'll say when I get to it, why I put that one last, like in the last word position. So look, on entrepreneurship, the literature out there, which you all know, right, says, well, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, you should have a learning mindset. You should be willing to have a bias towards action. You should be willing to learn to fail quickly and learn from that. And you should have just a sunny optimism about, doesn't matter what situation you're in, like you don't have the pulse for a tent, you'll figure it out. And I mean, just think about the experiences that we all had with OA. Like, how many went on trips where at least something didn't go wrong on the trip, or we went in the wrong direction for a while, or we ended up in the wrong spot, et cetera. And you armed us with the confidence to just be like, okay, we're going to figure it out. And that translated, one-to-one for me into, the entrepreneurial world. Look, in terms of resilience, there's nothing like being like, hey, I've just got a tarp, it's pouring rain. This describes my freshman trip, right? And we're all going to get soaked, and the, sleeping bags are going to be wet, and people are going to be actually cooking with an outdoor stove for the first time, not knowing that you have to boil the water before you put the rice in, otherwise it's going to burn. And, you're the leader on the trip trying to figure out why 2 nights in a row, like the campers have managed to burn the rice. And then you're like, wow, you didn't know how, like you had to boil the water first. And so you learn to really listen in a different way and not to assume anything. So I think one of the other things which is incredibly powerful that I took out of OA is how to learn how to ask good questions. As opposed to, just assert and that kind of thing. And then, look, on empathy, and the reason I, left that one for last. In the last 15 years or so in management training, like that's become a big thing. Please be authentic, have empathy, etc. Rick, you were into empathy before empathy was a thing. Now, I was trying to think of Rickisms from 30 years ago, and the one that stuck for me on that one is you were like, hey, where's your leader's radar? Yeah, and I don't know if you still use that phrase, but it is stuck, definitely there. And I've been in many like situations where there's, tense conversations and whatnot. And it's like, all right, let's take ourselves like out of the situation, be in the balcony, see what's going on in the dance and what's the leader's radar say about, to your point, what's really going on. So those would be three. I could have picked others, but ultimately entrepreneurship, resilience, and the empathy to make it all happen. And that came from OA. It didn't come from the 30 courses that I took and all of the stuff that was stuffed in our brain. This was really leadership in action.
Great.
Can I react to that, or do you want? I don't know
go
how
ahead.
much you want to get through
Go for it.
your questions.
Yep.
I want to react because I don't know anything about entrepreneurship. Maybe I come back in 10 years and, between my 20th, my 33, and, I'll figure out entrepreneurship since you were late to that. I not much to say on that, but the resiliency and the empathy were so aligned with the themes I was thinking about before today. And so if anything, I want to talk about it now because if I bring it up in 3 questions, I'm like, this is old news, Caroline. But resiliency in particular, like that's something I deal with and I think about on an almost daily basis. And what I'm doing now is helping people navigate through change. And it's like the most important thing. How can we be resilient? Reflecting on like what has helped shaped me be resilient, and how can I draw on the different experiences that I've had when I've like ultimately kind of all worked out in the end. And like one non-OA example that I think of that I know I was able to get through because of my OA experience. So Thanksgiving of 2022, about a year and a half ago, is when I left OA and I joined BMS. And I'd been there for about 3 months before my coworker said, like, "Oh, what are you going to do next? You know your job's going away in 3 months." And that was news to me. I'd worked at OA for 8.5 years. Like, there's a lot of job stability at Princeton. I would not have taken that role if I knew it was a short-term position. And I was like, I've not been here long enough to, I don't know, proven myself, have opportunities, but being able to approach that with a like, all right, I've been able to figure out everything else in the past. I faced a lot of weird situations. I've faced, we were talking earlier about the first ALTT I led when we, in October in Shenandoah, and we didn't have any tent poles, and we got in at 10 p.m. And I think everyone has a story like that. And somehow we got through it. Mostly okay. And being able to have that like curiosity to keep learning with, okay, I'll learn something from this role and then I'll learn something from my next role, and just like open-mindedness to see whatever I experience, I'll learn from. So that's like my reaction to resiliency. Like that's been my theme for the last 18 months, living and breathing resiliency, whether I want to or not. But then it's great because then I have to go into workshops and help coach others to be resilient. I'm like, okay, well, at least I've learned how to do this myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something I'm hearing both in entrepreneurship and resilience is just attitude and the importance of attitude to the way that you approach things. I also just led an ALTT, the first one in quite a few years.
Can you say what an ALTT is?
Yeah, it is an advanced leader training trip where we take a group of leaders who have already been through their leader training, who have already led an actual freshman orientation trip, and we kind of give them new simulations and try to kind of reflect on where they are as a leader right now and how we can build their skills up and make them an even more powerful leader. And I think that we had like our emergency situation was not tent poles, but it was a possibly rabid raccoon.
I prefer the tent pole situation. That sounds...
Yeah. But I mean, at the end of the day, it was all right. And I think that attitude, both between me and my co-leader in handling the situation and amongst our participants, was really, really important, especially as we made decisions about how to split the group, who to bring, it kind of always came down to like who has the right attitude, whose attitude is going to get them through this. And I think that kind of applies everywhere. I think that's going to apply in entrepreneurship. I think it applies very much to resilience. Yeah, 'cause I think it's just important to think that you can do it, and then you will.
Awesome. The next question I have for you all to sort of think about are, what are some of the like leadership tips that you would share? What are your big go-tos?
Right now, I'm on a big kick for listening first, which is something that I remember talking about a lot in OA context. But in my year and a half with Bristol Myers Squibb, I've worked on 3 different teams in different parts of the company. And again, I knew nothing starting, and then I keep moving around and not knowing anything, and just taking this approach of asking questions and listening to what they have to say, and then taking that in, like let it sink in, but not jumping necessarily to action right away. It's like, don't just do something, stand there. One of our mantras for Wilderness First Aid, and hearing what other people have to say. And then I might propose the solution I originally had in mind or a permutation of that. But I think I'm more effective as a leader in those situations. And I think I've seen how far it goes in building trust, and strengthening the relationships with the people that I'm working with, because I'm not coming in a condescending manner. Like, I know what's best for you. Like, let me hear what you have to say. And then let me see how I can adapt what I'm doing in order to support you. And that definitely is, listening first, I feel like was a theme of almost every end of night debrief on every LTT I led. Was some leader was working on like, this is my goal. I want to learn how to listen first. And like, okay, how are you doing on that? What are more opportunities you did that? When might we do more of that?
Yeah, couple of thoughts. So one would be just the term leadership implies that there's something one is trying to achieve, presumably with a group. So first thing is, joint clarity on the goal is incredibly important to have. And I think what I've found is that people often like to know enough of the why of what they're being asked to do together and what the purpose of it in order to fully buy into it. So that would be one. The other thing that I've seen over the years is a massive difference between leaders who go into a room simply focused on, in the meeting we're having or the interaction, like I want to get to X, versus people who go into that room and say, as a result of my being in that room, who is going to leave that room feeling empowered, having learned something, feeling trusted to go and get the thing done. And some of the most successful folks I've seen rise up the corporate ranks aren't necessarily the smartest or, et cetera. They're the ones who manage to, day after day, motivate others to bring their best selves to a task. And I've seen that their mindset when they're in a room is different than the ones that are just task oriented. And I think the equivalent on an OA trip is, encouraging everyone to participate in making the journey the kind of journey they want it to be, as opposed to feeling like, oh, well, you're supposed to do dinner, you're doing this, but there's no shared contribution or participation in the definition of the journey. So those would be 2 thoughts. I mean, maybe the third one would be this: is there are moments where, like, it is important to be the leader because you may have a certain expertise or the situation calls for, speed and action. So the equivalent, again, in these situations is when things get a little dicey or, there may be some risk involved. That's not necessarily the time to have a giant kumbaya and, and it's okay, right? But I think sometimes these days there's a reticence for people to step in and take accountability right away and go for it. And I actually think we miss a little bit of that sometimes in society today. So those would be 3 thoughts on tips. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm coming in with like a little bit of a different perspective. I think those are both super important. Um, but I think that probably over the past few years, I think like one of the most important things that I've learned is like trust in yourself and kind of the ability to be bold and to be vocal. I think especially as you grow up a young girl, and I think maybe just like anyone who is young and shy, it is incredibly scary to be the loudest voice in a room. I remember when I was 16, I had just finished my EMT class and I had started working. And I knew that I knew everything that I needed to know. I knew exactly how to deal with all of the medical things. Um, and yet I was not successful on any of my calls. And I couldn't figure out what was holding me back. I just didn't feel like in a room full of adults, I could be the one to speak up and to be in charge. And so I think a part of leadership that is, I mean, very base, but something that is often overlooked is just like trust in yourself and the kind of comfortability in authority. And I mean, it's obviously not something that you can just kind of snap your fingers and get. But learning to kind of slowly flex that muscle over time and practice it and build comfortability in it is really important. And I think another kind of like tangential thing is there was this summer camp that I have worked at for a couple of years, and one of their kind of most important leadership lessons that they give to us is about it's about a chancellor and a king. And so the king is a ruler and he is very powerful, he's very directive, and people hate him because he's not nice. And so he dies, the son comes in to be the new king, and he decides that he wants to be loved. So he gives the chancellor all of the jobs where he has to make court rulings, he has to kill people, he has to do all of the nasty jobs, and he himself can then do all of the fun things. He can kiss all of the babies, he can do all of the wedding ceremonies, he can cut all of the ribbons, and he is loved, but he is not respected. Um, and so then he decides to change his mind and he flips the roles. He says, okay, now I get to do all the bad things and you get to do all the fun things. You're going to kiss the babies, you're going to cut the ribbons, you're going to do the wedding ceremonies, and I am going to do the beheadings and the court rulings. And instead of respect, what he got was anger, and he was ousted. And I think that coming in and being able to be assertive and consistent will give you the respect that then can lead to building trust and relationships and all of the fun in a group that you want. Yeah.
Awesome. And one of the things to highlight that a bunch of you have said is about growth mindset, which is a key element. And so I just want to give a shout out to Leila. Leila has her leader trainer notebook in front of her. She's sitting here taking notes, during this talk about, ooh, this is something important. So to me, that's like sort of the epitome of what OA leader trainers are about. Is growth mindset.
Yeah, and just to build on what you've said, Leila, because it really struck a chord with me. The other thing is, the leaders that I most respect are the ones that get amazing things done, and yet their sense of self-esteem is not tied to their role. It comes from inside, right? And so they do what they do because they love doing it, because they find purpose in it. But ultimately, if there comes a moment where it's not the right role for them to be the leader, they're okay giving it up to somebody else. And it's another word we haven't used, but just having the humility to realize when it's appropriate for oneself to be the leader and when it's appropriate to give it up. And that doesn't mean not being assertive, right? It's in the situations, but I find that too many folks, once they get to positions of power, right, they enjoy the position and tie their sense of self to that, as opposed to being motivated by what's truly inside. So that was the connection I made when you shared those stories with us. And I do think people who do that get a ton of respect.
And I mean, I think that like a lot of growth that I've seen both in myself and in a lot of my participants has been maybe like learning to take a step back from like the fun and silly first into like the more just like wide view of like what are our goals, what are we doing, what is my role as the leader here, before then getting to jump into the fun, the silly, the trail songs, the games that then make it even more special.
When you all think about OA in 50 years, how would you describe what is that legacy around leadership over the last 50 years?
Well, I'll start with a few thoughts, and maybe Are you going to follow up with the next 50 years, or do you want us to talk about that now?
We can
as well?
talk about that
Yeah.
afterwards.
Afterwards?
Yes.
Okay.
What is the next 50?
So, I mean, listen, 26,000 people having done it, and how many leaders you said?
About 3,600.
3,600? Okay. And being a massive inspiration for lots of other schools to do it for the first time, right? Look, I look at an organization that I have a lot of respect for, Protect Our Winters, and what they're doing, right? And so it's basically an organization out west that was started by mostly, folks you wouldn't necessarily have thought would do this, professional skiers and snowboarders, but they're working very actively now in specific seats where there's folks who are, for the House in particular, not environmentally prone versus who are. They're working very hard to get the environmentalists elected, basically. But basically, the idea being, let's counter climate change so we can still go skiing, hiking, doing the things we love to do. I myself draw a pretty clear line between the kind of education that OA provides and has inspired others to do, to now seeing organizations like that saying, like, let's do something active. And what would be interesting when people come back in the fall, right, is to get a sense for, even if it's not full time, the kinds of things that people are doing in their communities around the outdoors. But I think you would find that if we surveyed the 26,000 folks, particularly, and the 3,600 in particular, and said, has this enabled you to have the courage to go and do things that you thought weren't possible, you'd find a lot of really interesting answers. So, I think one of the reasons that this university hasn't really needed fraternities and sororities as much is because of OA. Because people have a place to go if they're not on a sports team, for example, right? So those would be a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, I think that when I think about the 50 years of the past, I think about my past few years here. And I think that every interaction I have with an OA leader has been so deeply informative and curious. And I think that I have never not learned an immense amount from every other leader that I've talked to. And I think that that is both my co-leaders and all of the wealth of skills that they have, and being able to see them kind of operate in their leadership and being just in awe of how everyone else does it, as well as kind of talking to trainees and not only like giving them feedback, but asking for it and understanding like what their perspectives on the trip are, what their perspectives on leadership are, and where they feel like they want to go in their leadership is just kind of the most important thing. And I mean, I think that can extrapolate across the last 50 years. And I'm sure that those people have gone off into the world and continued to be leaders and to touch their communities in just ways that bring new perspectives and new curiosities. And yeah, I just think that's important. It's how you create like a community of learning and of compassion. Yeah.
My first response is, in terms of OA's leadership legacy, is encouraging everyone to be a leader, letting everyone know that there's a place for them as a leader if they're interested, if they want to. I don't know. I don't 100% remember what was going through freshman Caroline's mind, but I don't think I thought of myself as a leader. I remember reflecting on this a couple of years ago with some OA leaders. Like, I was really, really quiet and shy my freshman year. And they were like, excuse me, you're like leading these massive songs with 300 OA leaders during pre-trip. Like, you were quiet? And like, yeah, and I gained confidence and I learned about the outdoors. Similar to Rick, my first backpacking trip was my own. Well, yeah, I guess it was your second, but my first backpacking trip was my freshman orientation trip. And so it was not a physical space I had a lot of confidence in. It wasn't the leadership skills I had a lot of confidence in, but all I had to do was sign up, and it gave me something to do for fall break. My family didn't want me home, so I was like, all right, I'll stay for fall break freshman year. And I remember on one of my early road trips with Rick, I think we were going up to OOPS my sophomore year, maybe the Outdoor Orientation Program Symposium, talking about like some of the philosophy behind OA and how all of the other schools who had similar outdoors programs, a lot of them you have to apply to get in the program. And once you apply and you're accepted, then you can go on the training. And the challenge of that is you get the people who've been on a Knowles trip or an Outward Bound trip or had whatever personal experiences prior. Whereas at OA, it's very much, it's always been, and I know it's Rick's intention that it always be, anyone who's interested, you can come sign up for training. We'll take you in. We'll teach you what we have. You might not complete the training. You might decide, actually, this isn't for you, but we hope that you'll learn something from whatever you're able to participate in. And I think that's a huge part of the legacy. And when we think about 3,600 OA leaders, how many of them, I'm sure some thought of themselves as leaders before they came, but how many others came to identify with that title as a result of OA and as a result of wearing those OA leader t-shirts. And the other thing that comes to mind in terms of the OA legacy is the ability to cut across so many different communities on campus. I know that we're definitely not perfect in terms of the diversity and representing the whole Princeton student body and amongst OA leaders. And I think it's pretty remarkable how many different pockets we're able to engage and how we're able to make OA attractive to so many different people. And I'm thinking about that especially during reunions, because I'll be walking across campus and walking with one of my roommates who is not involved with OA, and I get stopped constantly, far more than they do, because like, oh, well, that person was on my training trip and this person was my freshman, and like, oh, well, we were fresh trip coordinators. And like, how do you know people who are MAE and math and English and in 2D and in this club? And I'm like, I had my department, I had my clubs too, but I think compared to my roommates who I tended to identify with like one or two tribes, the OA organization just gave me meaningful relationships with so many people from so many different parts of campus.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a specific story, actually, because this was 1 year after graduating. And your point about having the confidence to just figure things out and take some risks. So I ended up in South Africa, and I was working with McKinsey. This was 1995, and we'd been hired to help the country figure out how to deregulate the electric utility markets. And the reason that the government wanted to do it is they wanted to prove to the world that they were now modern. Okay. So you taught us to think from first principles. Yes, there's a map, but you also need a compass, and sometimes you need to go a different way. And I was going to be the person stuck doing the big complicated model to figure out what would happen to electric utility prices. But I was like, wait a sec, Mandela's number one goal is to bring electricity to the townships. And there's 4 billion rand at the electric utility on the balance sheet. and the newspaper says it's 4 billion rand to bring electricity to the townships. If we deregulate the markets, it's going to really help the existing white consumers, but the 4 billion rand at the utility is going to disappear. And so there won't be any money to electrify the townships. So we get into the room, and it's the head of the London office and the European electric utility expert and all these like senior guys. And they're like, oh, well, you're going to have to do this and do this and do that in the model. And finally, I was like, I have to speak up. So I was like, hey, why are we even doing this? Explaining what I just explained to you, and literally silence in the room. The head of the London office goes, huh, hadn't thought of it that way. Turns to the European electric utility expert. He goes, hadn't thought of it that way either. Then the head of the London office, who was an ex-All Blacks New Zealand referee, so he played a lot of sports, he's like, sounds like we screwed up, and we should actually advise them to shut the markets for 10 years and figure out how to bring electricity to the townships. So we go in the next day, and the board of the utility is 11 older South African white guys and the token black businessman at the time. And we get screamed out of the room because they say, wait, we'd hired you to prove that we were modern and all of this stuff, and now you're telling us to do like the Russians. But they called us the next day and they said, look, we talked to Mandela last night, and he wants you all to figure out how to bring electricity to the townships, right? So I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that if I hadn't had all of these experiences out there, in nature, figuring it out from first principles. So might still be, by the way, the most meaningful thing I've done professionally. So anyway, thank you for that.
And that's, I've just heard so many stories over the years from different alumni leaders that sort of, echo that, of, people who just stepped up into a situation that they didn't have any previous experience with, and, was their OA experience. One of these panels that we did probably 5 or 6 years ago, one of the people was a former leader trainer, and she was a plastic surgery resident at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And so she said, reflecting on her OA leadership, she said, the biggest responsibility that I had until I was chief resident was leading an outdoor action trip of a bunch of 18-year-olds out in the boonies. And she said, like, that helped prepare me to be chief resident in a big metropolitan hospital in Boston. Yeah. So I think the other question that we sort of threw out there is, what should the next 50 years look like?
You seem ready for that.
Right.
All right, I'm happy to go first. So there's been a recent book by Jonathan Haidt around, how the use of cell phones and social media and whatnot has dramatically impacted kids. And at least he's a proponent of the theory that that's part of the underlying reason with the spike in behavioral and mental health issues in society. And what I found through OA, right, was that and almost invariably, I think this occurred on every trip that I led, and what I've done in the outdoors since, is you bring people out of their day-to-day into that environment, and they're able to be a different kind of human. I still deeply believe that bringing people outdoors in that way, and ideally taking your phones away in that kind of interaction, can help people connect to a different level of being a human than what we get in our highly, highly digitized society. So when I think of this over the next 50 years, technology is not going to go away, right? AI is only going to further accelerate where we're at. So using something like the experience of the outdoors to teach people how to lead and also to connect with their deeper humanity. That to me feels like it would be an incredible contribution to education. And I think for some folks, doing it in this sort of way is the equivalent of people going on meditation retreats or, getting that kind of centering. Right. So, I just hope that we can continue to make this kind of experience available, not just to Princeton students, but to more and more folks. Yeah.
I might sneeze in a second.
I can go. Yeah, I mean, I sort of, in many ways, hope that the next 50 years looks a lot like the past 50 years. I think that, everything that we talked about in terms of like touching communities and being able to have access to so many communities are incredibly special things. And I would hate to see those be the changes. And I think that there's kind of a lot of the pieces of like the broader outdoors conversation that I think will change in the next 50 years, like bringing in mindfulness into the outdoors, bringing in like attitudes towards what our role is in terms of how we interact with the outdoors. And things like accessibility, things like diversity are all things that are inevitably going to evolve in the next 50 years. And so, I hope that those things change in ways that builds the organization up and continue to kind of build access to communities and the curiosity and humanity of OA. I just hope that those things, as they change, inevitably change OA for the better.
Yeah, it went away. But we're all good. I'm thinking, like, what can we learn from a individual OA trip and then bring to the meta level and apply to OA as a program in terms of like how that might be our inspiration for what the future is. And a theme that's come out through our conversations and just generally when I reflect back on OA trips is being open to changes. Being open to, okay, our route is changing because there's a rabid raccoon and we don't have the tent and there's hurricane strength winds and actually there's hurricane strength winds across the entire eastern US. Whatever the change, that was a fun year. Whatever the changes are, there's always something that's coming up. And if we go into a situation like, well, this is what our plan was. We mapped it out. Like this is what worked in the past. That doesn't mean that that's what's going to work in the future. And so being successful in leading a frost trip requires that, flexibility, that resilience, that like I can deviate from the plan. I can do something different and that can still be successful. That might actually be even more successful because you're thinking about, well, what's the ultimate goal of this trip? The ultimate goal of this trip is orientation and connecting these people. The ultimate goal of this trip is the leadership development. And however we achieve that, the first OA trip I led, which was probably my most successful frost trip, was with the year of the hurricane in 2012. And we spent 2 nights in a motel in Maryland because everybody got evacuated because there was too much rain. And that was a great trip. That group was so bonded. I was one of my participants from that trip. His wife had a baby yesterday. I was just texting with it, Ben Denzer. And if we'd held on to this like original belief of like, well, this is what we thought the trip was going to be, then I don't know what would have happened, but we would have been very wet and cold and unhappy and never spoken to each other again. But we adapted and said, okay, well, the goal is orientation. So how can we achieve that? And then that was, again, an experience that I went through with Rick and Colin. 2020. Were you working 2020 or the following summer?
I think it was 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're 2021, right? When we had to, the wonderful challenge of creating a virtual outdoor orientation trip because nobody was allowed back on campus. And we started with like, well, what's the point of orientation actually? And starting with that question, I think really shaped the outcome because some of our peers at other colleges were like, we're going to have one person hiking and they're going to wear a GoPro and everyone else is going to watch them hike for 6 hours a day. And like, okay, that like, is the most literal virtual translation of an OA trip, and that would probably be terrible. And so we're like, okay, well, it's actually about this connection. So how can we foster that connection and that trust in the Zoom context? And maybe we have some outdoors components, but it might not actually be it might be redefined. And so thinking to the future, I think it's that same mentality of remembering what's important and what that like magic sauce of OA is, and holding on to that and letting other things change. So the role of orientation within the university calendar might change. The ability to go backpacking in the places we currently go might change because we might have really terrible droughts and there's no water anywhere on our backpacking routes. And so we got to change to adapt to that. Maybe it's base camp terms, but I think there's so many. With each of those, there's opportunities to adapt and make it even better, rather than saying, well, this is the way we've always done it, so we got to stick with it. So that's my hope for the next 50 years.
Yeah, maybe as a fun one, if we were thinking about productizing OA, right, in the age of AI, think of being able with a pin or something to capture over the course of a year or several years, every OA conversation in either the leadership training context or on the trips, and then be able to talk back to the AI and say, what would OA do?
Thank you all. We want to just sort of throw it open to all of you. Are there questions that you have for these three? Are there comments, things that you want to share about your experience with OA and leadership?
I didn't expect to have this here, but we're in the process. I'm participating in a volunteer effort, and we're in the process of doing a team building exercise. And I'm starting to realize that we need people to come out and be ready to work on just whatever, but also there's a group goal. There's something that the group overall needs to accomplish. And I wonder if you could talk about that dynamic between opening things up so everybody feels like they can just jump in and do something, but also keeping it moving somewhere, so that the people who are just jumping in aren't jumping in where the other person is jumping in, or they're sort of learning to share, learning to work with each other, learning to take advantage of their strengths, and then listening for that group consensus. Yes, we do need to go in this direction.
I mean, one thought for what I've found very useful is having an opening session where everyone is invited to share what the goal means to them in their own words and what it is that might be standing in the way or impacting their ability to being a player in achieving that goal. So it might be that there's something preoccupying them at home, or there's a kid that's sick, or whatever it might be, and then people then creating a safe space to be able to, as you're proceeding towards the goal with the group, being able to share in those things and use it as a way to have permission to bring somebody back in who might be finding it more difficult to be participating towards the joint goal as opposed to whatever might be going on in their own minds. That's just a thought from a facilitation point of view. Incidentally, it works really well in the corporate context as well. I think some companies do this on a weekly basis, but it's a way to find out that, so-and-so is being a real jerk this week because, there's actually something real going on, and the others, if it's safe to share it, are able to help, as opposed to being like, why is this person, not rowing with the entire boat, so to speak.
Diffuse that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think creating permission is really important.
Leila talked about the FVC, which is a full value commitment. And so lots of people who have led OA trips recently will know that that's something that we do on all the trips, where you talk about what are the goals that you're there for? What are the goals of everybody in the group? What are the goals of OA? Things like Leave No Trace and stuff like that. So doing that right at the beginning of an experience helps everybody ground everybody, and you get all that stuff out on the table, and that can have a tremendous difference in terms of what the outcome is. And what you said reminds me of something. This morning there was a panel in here that we did with Princeton in Asia, and so Josh Morris, class of '99, spoke, and he gave this brief story about helicopter accidents, and he said that there were lots of helicopter accidents in the '90s, and they tried to figure out why, and they couldn't figure it out, and they decided it wasn't mechanical, that it had to be something with the pilots. So what they started to do was they would do a 45-minute session with the pilots before they would start to fly for the day, and they would just ask them, like, what's on your mind? Like, like, the goal about being a helicopter pilot is being focused, because it's a hard thing to do. And so they would just let people talk about what was on their mind. And, oh my gosh, well, I'm worried about my mortgage, or my kid's not doing well in school. And they suddenly found that spending that 45 minutes just like talking about that stuff and getting it off the table, they were much more focused, and the accident rate went down significantly. And so back to what you're saying, that part of it is also getting people to this sort of sense of mindfulness about what it is they're actually trying to do, and giving people the opportunity to unload some of the other things that they are on their mind, so they can focus now on what's here.
The whole time you all were speaking so wonderfully about your leadership takeaways from the OA process, I was wondering a little bit what went on in that black box of the OA leader development process. And Caroline, you touched on a couple of little tenets of it, but I wonder, without being mundane and describing the curriculum, I wonder if you could look back at the experience you went through and talk about some of the resonant pieces of it that really impacted you. And in particular, since you all span about 30 years, have there been any significant changes that you're aware of?
And that's a question we asked Rick before this started. It was like, I know what Leila was trained on, because I trained you. I didn't lead your trip, but I overlapped in the field with them multiple times. So I have a sense of that. I have no idea what came before. And we were all kind of saying, like, Rick, you've been here 47 of the 50 years. You have a good sense of how it's evolved, why it's evolved. And I don't know, maybe you can share some of your reflections, and then we can, as you highlight, like, this is something we did then each of us can chime in and say.
And I'm going to turn to Andy Brown, who's class of '69. Andy hired me to come back to be the director of outdoor action. He hired me as an intern, and I came back in 1981, 2 years after I graduated. So Andy was here when OA began.
That's an interesting question. Is it working? It's an interesting question you're asking. OA was actually an offshoot of Outward Bound. Josh Miner, who began Outward Bound in this country, was a Princeton graduate and learned basically from working in the Second World War that a lot of the ships that went down lost many of the younger sailors, and they couldn't understand why. The older sailors, in part, seemed to survive better than the younger ones, and they determined to find a way to be able to correct that. And the essential way was by giving them a greater sense of self-worth, self-confidence, and a belief in themselves that they might be able to get out of this situation after their boat had gone down from a German torpedo or whatever it was. So they went through this whole Outward Bound training. Josh Miner's learning of this brought it over to this country. We developed it and basically started it, I think, in 74 or 5.
74.
And I was here that was a pilot program of about 8 individuals. I was here for the next year, and we, I think, sent them maybe 75 or 100 out.
The first real frost trip was 100 in the fall of 74 for the class of 78.
Okay, so, but it was an interesting process. The whole goal of Outward Bound and outdoor action, in my mind, is to give people a greater sense of being able to work together and a greater self-confidence and a belief in themselves that, yes, they alone, but together especially, can solve problems that they may not be able to solve otherwise. So it's an extremely exciting program to be part of. And having been part of it basically off and on for 50 years, it's immensely rewarding. And I've seen a lot of offshoots of the same thing. One of our members actually took it up and started the program at Harvard a number of years later. So there are many offshoots of outdoor action that have actually been done by alumni out of this program, quite honestly. But it's an interesting process to watch the whole thing as it's matured over the years. But I'm not going to take up any more time. I'll let these people do it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Actually, it makes a connection for me because prior to Princeton, I went to one of the United World Colleges. You know this, and it was founded by the same folks. What I was gonna say is, I mean, how much did you have to fight the administration over the years over the amount of trust that you had in all of the leaders and the independence that you gave us to go and do these things, right? Because people kept saying there's too much risk, right? How can we be letting, sophomores, juniors, and seniors out in the wild like this? There were some tough moments around that over time, and yet you managed to create this amazing vessel that allowed us to be. Well, I mean, honestly, you treated us like independent adults much more so than we might have had the chance in other parts of, our education here. So it's very much what you're reflecting on, right? Which the ability to learn to risk take and learn from it is just very different.
And much of the answer to that would be we essentially learned ways to use our budget that the administration was not even aware of at the time. And frequently it was a question of asking forgiveness rather than permission.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, and essentially it was trusting the individuals and the leaders and Rick's leadership and being able to train people in such a way that we weren't going to run into the kind of problems that were going to get us into serious trouble. And I think over the years he's proved that over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And the book's basically to help other people do the same.
Yeah.
So, but don't let me take it.
Yeah, and I what I would say is, I think for me the sort of secret sauce is, one, we do a lot more leader training than many of our peers. It's a lot longer process. There's, the downside of that is that, it takes a significant commitment on people to say, I'm going to spend like 2 weeks, basically a week on campus and a week in the woods, to do this. So we ask a lot. And so I think part of it is providing, a lot of good training. And then I think the other, piece of that is, having lots of sort of support structures, from a risk management standpoint in place, to basically, create environments where people can go out and make decisions. And we know that things are going to happen. We know that things are going to, there's going to be bad weather, there's going to be storms, there's going to be various things. But, as Caroline talked about her first trip, in 2011, when we had to evacuate 1,000 people from, like 6 states. If you have, enough infrastructure in place to handle that, then when things happen, then you mitigate what the actual consequences are. And so, I think the goal is being able to have people be out in real situations and have the support structures to deal with things that happen. And to me, that's part of the balance is, Jean was one of the hard first aid instructors. And so he was teaching people how to do first aid, how to handle it, in the backcountry. And so all those kinds of things. And I think the other big piece, I think, is that, so much of it is students teaching other students.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because the word co-creation is all the rage now, right? In leadership training and Burning Man and all of these things. And again, just like empathy, right? You were into enabling us to co-create both as a group, but for ourselves, right? Way before it was a thing.
The fascinating thing about that is the university, I think, acknowledges and understands the degree to which basically creating this group of leaders and others on campus, many of whom have contact with other administrators throughout the entire outdoor action and beginning process, students suddenly come to campus with a very different feeling. They begin to feel a sense of trust in the administration because they met a few of them and they've interacted with them and they feel like they're real people. And my greatest frustration, quite honestly, with the institution now is creating so many different layers of the administration that it's very rare that students have a real communication level or ability with members of the upper level of the administration. And to me, it's one of the great reasons why we had so many problems with the most recent demonstrations on campus, because there is no sense of communication, easy communication between those two parts. That is the students on one side and the administration, especially the upper levels of the administration on the other side, which has so many different layers at this point. And the problem with that is it's been seen in so many other different campuses across the country. We actually had Nassau Hall Nassau had demonstration back when South Africa was a big issue, was taken over by the students in, I think it was 1983. And we went in, basically talked to them at great length and whatever. They eventually went out after that Sunday, so they didn't get into a great deal of trouble. They had no desire to really disrupt the university in any way. They simply wanted the ability to basically feel that they were respected, feel that they were listened to, and feel that they got their point across and were able to basically express the degree to which they had strong feelings at the time. And we were able to give them that ability, basically mostly because they were respected and they were listened to. And sadly enough, I think they aren't able to do that in many places now. And it's harder on this campus than it used to be because of the additional levels of the administration. But at the same time, I think outdoor action is a crucial piece of the overall campus ability to do that. It's to be able to interact, to be able to get a sense of who you are with regard to the people that you're working with, professors, administrators, whatever. So it's an interesting culture from that point of view, and it's an extremely important piece of the overall Princeton culture.
And I would say, over my tenure, what I would say is that, I think OA is like a really untapped resource by the institution. I think there's so much more that we could do around health and wellness in terms of being outside, so mental health for students, leadership development, I think team building, all of those sorts of things. I think the primary focus is on the orientation program, and then sort of the leadership training program is the engine that feeds that. You can't run the orientation program without that. But I think there's like an incredible wealth of things when we think about the next 50 years. I have people come to me all the time and ask, if could we do a trip for so and so, and could we do leadership development for a particular department, and we don't sort of have the capacity to do that. And so I think that there's a lot more that OA can do. I think it's a real I think the next 50 years could really see OA blossom, in a way that it did when it, I think the first, 50 years was growing the outdoor action trips from 10 people to 800 plus another 227 leaders. That was what we had out that year. So over 1,000 people in the field at one time. That's like more people, in terms of the number of people that are out at one time. That's like more people than Knowles or Outward Bound have out at a single time. So we really sort of blossomed that. But I think in terms of the other things that we could do around leadership, development, other things, it'd be great to see it blossom in those ways as well.
Actually, we found on the trail that outdoor action had more student days on the trail than many of those other programs, whether it was Outward Bound, whichever one of the Outward Bound programs, in Knowles or whatever. I mean, it's an incredible program in its breadth and size.
I was on, well, you probably were too, on the trip in 1975. So I think we might be the two in the room who did it. And it was such a game changer for everything, how I understood Princeton. And you're one of the reasons I came to Princeton, by the way. I met you before I came on campus, before I accepted Princeton. And the fact that you were so accessible, you just brought that up, was one of the reasons that I came. And I knew your involvement with OA. So since then, I've been an interviewer for Princeton admissions. Every single time I've ever done it, I've told students to do OA. I'm actually now working with another university, and I want to get more information to try to develop something like it. And I just wanted to thank everybody who's been involved with it, because I just think it's such a critical and positive part of Princeton.
For the initial years, we tried to have a faculty member or administrator on every trip in order to basically break that sort of barrier, so that they had the sense that there was a friend or somebody they could go to.
I wanted to ask whether OA is in a position to have an impact on the culture. Because we have a lot of discussion going on where one person doesn't trust another, or the older people don't trust the younger people. And to me, from this discussion, it sounds like OA has exactly the resources needed to talk in a different way. And is it possible to get that story to be sufficiently well heard that people would listen to each other differently?
Throw it up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Caroline talked about listening first, and I think like being able to impart that skill onto people, being able to kind of deliver them listening as a tool to interaction, I think is something that would be incredible just for communications with anyone ever. And then I think also in terms of getting people to build listening and trust, I think that creating cultures of feedback and of compassion are really important. And I mean, what Rick talked about with helicopter pilots and like having them be able to share is a huge way to build that kind of compassion, and just kind of building feedback into the structures and the fabric of an organization is huge. And then one more thing I'll say is that I think that we undervalue play as a value in an OA. I think that it's very much built in there, and yet we never really talk about it. I think it is probably the most important part of our leader training, is just kind of letting people play before you have any expectations of what is going to come out of that, and then being able to use that as a tool to build trust and to build communication and to build sort of a community and make people feel like they have something in common and they can do things together.
Leila, what I'm thinking about the skills you identified, listening and empathy, I think that those are they really come out in the leader training process, whether through the workshops or explicitly talking about listening and different active listening skills, and then in the leader training trip when you're practicing and then you're getting that feedback and then you're actually leading. And so I would guess that your question about do we have the resources to have a culture team, and I think we're always doing the right things with leaders. And then in a separate bucket, there's orientation where there's the right breadth of so many people on this campus being touched by orientation. But perhaps an opportunity is for really being able to shift the overall culture of campus, is thinking about how can some of the skills taught in training, where we're explicitly talking about listening, how might that have a place in the orientation? Because I think orientation, at least when I think back on my own experiences as an orientation leader, I was demonstrating those skills, and I think it was positively contributing to their experience, but it wasn't explicit. I wasn't saying, and now I'm asking an open-ended question because it's going to invite all of you into this conversation. That's what we do on the LTT. So that may be, I guess as we think to the next 50 years, an opportunity to consider of how can we take the best of those kind of two legs, those two pillars of OA, some of the skills taught in training and the large population impacted by orientation, to amplify the impact.
Yeah, and then just real quick, I mean, this country is getting so polarized, right? And the beauty in my mind of an OA trip or recreating that kind of experience beyond Princeton is on an OA trip, it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. It doesn't matter, what your, physical capabilities are, et cetera, et cetera. Like, to your point about the shared goal earlier, like the shared goal at a basic level is to make it out okay, right? Right? Like let's be clear, and then beyond that, it's, hey, if we can layer in getting to know each other as humans and then having an awesome time, et cetera, that's what takes it from, a Pavlovian success, right, to something you'll never forget. And just the wonder that I would see on each of the frost trips, and about half of the group, many who'd like lived in urban environments and never been out in nature, and being like, wow, I was able to do this. And I now come into campus a week later and I have like a safety net of a set of folks that, are not in my residential college or not in, whatever. And yet I can refer back to on just a deeper level. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it already has, in my mind, a massive impact on culture. The question for me is, how can you scale some of this? Because the reality is this kind of an experience is a hell of a privilege. And I mean that in a very positive way. But so how do we, get others to have that kind of an experience?
And
Congress to do it.
Yes.
yeah, and I like Caroline. I think your point. I mean, so for the people in the room who've been leader trainers, I think the workshops and the things that we do on campus are more like building blocks, and then we sort of talk about going on the leader training trip where it's 6 days out in the field and you're actually doing it. Like that's where, at the meta level, those building blocks become a structure. And it really is because it's a very experiential learning process. People are learning by doing, and the leader trainers are, pretending to be homesick people or falling down and pretending to sprain their ankles, and people have to deal with it. And there's all this feedback about how did you handle that? That's something that people rarely get. People rarely get like somebody who is willing to like put all this energy into saying, hey, talk to me about how you led that. How would you do it differently? What do you think went well? Like, people don't get that. And so the leader training trip is this really special place where you get to practice and make mistakes where there's no real consequences. And somebody's willing to actually sit down and talk to you and share with you about how you're performing. And that doesn't happen very often. And so, I mean, I think, Caroline, to your point, about like, how do we bring that into to the frost trip and the orientation program? What I see from leader trainers and what many of you have said is, because of being a leader, I use those skills all the time. I use the VOMP conflict resolution with my roommate, or whatever. So the next challenge for us is, how do we, get the folks who were just on that trip for 4 days to understand some of the things that they've actually learned and apply them. It's the transference piece.
Well, I mean, imagine if AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene had to go on an OA trip together, or Kim Kardashian and Taylor Swift, right? I mean, come on, it's...
That's a reality TV show I would watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have something. So we came late because we got lost.
Yeah.
A lot's changed apparently.
Yes.
So I have a gush thank you that then turns to a question, but I have to thank you first to get to the question. So she's the first person I ever met at Princeton because we were assigned to go someplace in Dillon Gym and meet each other. She's the second person I ever met at Princeton because you assigned us somehow to G15, and we did the Delaware Water Gap together. And They were my bridesmaids. I was her bridesmaid. I was their bridesmaid. I then married a boy from C55 who I met. I was his leader. We waited a year before we dated. I've told you all this. I'm telling you all this because you and the program that you have created on a very personal level, and for all of us, it is my whole life. My children are because of you. My best friends are because of you. My entire social network is because of this program. And I wanted to say that publicly. So that's my gush. So my question is, maybe you've already done it, but could you post the maps to the trips so that we can go do G15?
Oh, sure.
I can't remember. And
Caroline, yeah, we have
I
all
don't work
those.
here anymore, Rick.
But Caroline knows that we have all those things.
I would love it if it was even like you had to get a special OA password or something so that we could have, I want to take my children on the trail where I met their father.
Oh, wow.
And I know that we're not alone. There's so many of us who met our people on those trails. I would love if we could have access to those trips.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have those.
We're all here. I'm sorry we were late. We're
No.
25th reunion and we're a mess right now.
And my story is like I didn't go on my. Some people know this story. I didn't go on my frost trip. I had taken a gap year and I hated the outdoors. And so I didn't go on frost trip. So Andy probably remembers that. But my brother was a senior when I was a freshman, and he was an OA leader. And I got to know people like Ed Saliga and Jane Freeman, some of the early group of OA leaders, and they were the neatest people I'd met on campus. And I said, okay, I have to try this. Even though I hated the outdoors, I went on a fall break weekend backpacking trip in the Delaware Water Gap with, as Andy was saying, a really diverse group. There was a couple of undergrads, 2 juniors who were the leaders. There was a 60-year-old woman who was the head chemistry librarian and her 14-year-old nephew, and then a guy named Ed Edenfield, who was the assistant dean at the engineering school. It was an incredibly diverse trip. And I had this fantastic time, and I said, wow, this outdoor thing is amazing. So I went through leader training as a first-year student and then led trips for the rest of my time at Princeton. So, I would never have done any of, the whole 43 years of my career wouldn't have existed if I hadn't gone on OA. So, and I know that it's true for lots of people that OA was, and we don't expect people to go off and become backpacking leaders, but that OA is something that I think we all carry with us as a powerful sort of, thing that has been life-changing or inspiring.
Kids that I can splint their leg with a stick and a cup. Whether I really can or not remains to be seen, but in my mind, I think I can handle it. I can do a gaping chest wound. I just use a tarp. I've got it.
Hope we don't find it.
Oh my God, I don't want to ever know.
Right.
Ever.
It's very interesting because one of the things we say about OA is opportunity to go out, get to know a group of other people, basically come to campus with a group of friends, and maybe a relationship with a professor or something else like that in order to basically ease the transition into the process. It's so much more than that. In actuality, what we're really trying to do is give people the opportunity to go out with others and develop a greater sense of themselves, a greater self-confidence, a greater belief in themselves, a greater sense of self-worth. And most of all, at least in my opinion, is a sense of compassion. Because you're with other people, some of them need help at times, some of them don't, some of them are helping others, and you gain this sense of what it feels like to work and help other people. And that, to me, is one of the most important things of all. Because now, all of a sudden, you've developed a sense or ability to have sympathy for others, to realize that others who may be a little different than you are still worthwhile and have value. And so you build on that and build on that. And that's one of the things our class actually created Princeton in Africa and Princeton Latin America, and we helped Princeton in Asia grow and grow. And that's the same kind of thing that those programs do. So the culture here, and this is the only place where those programs really exist. Some other schools have sort of offshoots that are sort of very dissimilar. They don't do anything like what we're doing. But all of those programs are designed to help students, basically, and others learn how to develop and grow and give them the experiences where they can do that. It's not something you can teach. You can't teach compassion.
but you can give people the opportunity to experience the benefits and beauty of it. And that's what happens. And they come back different people, whether they go on OA or any of the other programs. So OA to me is an absolutely essential and crucial piece of this whole thing. And I applaud you for having carried it on and done so well with it for 47 years.